Emeritus means recovering. I'm a recovering professor. I didn't know I was going to be introduced by an earth scientist when I showed my first slide, let alone someone from the Church of the Epiphany. Happenstance is very good. In 40 years of research, this is the study that I remember the most, and that was certainly the most moving to me. And it's a very good story. So what I'm going to do is tell you the story, basically, of what we learned and what we found. In fiction, somebody from studying English, in fiction, the phenomenon of epiphany, of a sudden change of personality, is certainly there. I mean, Dickens' character of Ebenezer Scrooge is embedded in Western consciousness as an example of that. The old Frank Capra movie, It's a Wonderful Life, again, is a very out-of-the-ordinary experience that happens to a man who is left quite a different person after that. In religions, the same stories appear, of course. If you have a Christian background, you know about the Apostle Paul literally getting knocked off his horse. Although it doesn't actually say anything about a horse in the Bible, but that's the traditional way we remember it. And being a completely changed around person afterwards. Among spiritual leaders, if you go into biography, you will find lots and lots and lots of stories like this. So all of these people had a particular moment in their life when things really changed for them, when they became a different person in a way. When a Methodist church, so John Wesley said, I felt my heart strangely warmed in this mystical experience that he had. The Buddha, Moses, Martin Luther, Julian of Norwich, all of them write about turning points in their own lives. Also happens among social reformers. So Joan of Arc obviously had some out-of-the-ordinary mystical experiences that changed her life around. The co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, Bill Wilson, had a very famous mystical experience that was the end of his drinking after a very long drinking career that changed him as a person. The Native American reformer Hanson Lake, Jane Addams, one of the key people in social work, Malcolm X, all of them having these sudden transformational experiences. So they turn up in biography as well. Also, great writers, Tolstoy and Dostoevsky both had such epiphany experiences in the course of their careers. C.S. Lewis, Kierkegaard, famously. So I got wondering, why has psychology not studied this phenomenon? I got interested because I was bumping into people who had had something that seemed like that kind of experience. And actually my daughter had such an experience just before I went on sabbatical. And so on the sabbatical leave, which is where the best things in my career have happened, I have time to really think about things and pull them together. I thought, how would you study this? And who's written about it? And the last person in psychology I could find who wrote about it is William James in 1902. And in his book, Varieties of Religious Experience, which had quite an influence in Alcoholics Anonymous, by the way, he writes very clearly about these transformational changes that people have. He talked about type 1 change, which is how most of us change most of the time. We just kind of plod along, small steps, and a little bit backsliding, and a little step forward, and just a little bit at a time. Most of us change that way most of the time. And it's kind of like just slowly drifting along in a stream, he said. But then there's this other kind of change that happens suddenly. It's very discreet. It's permanent. So it's like you went through a door that you don't go back through. And it's more like shooting rapids than floating down a stream. It happens very quickly. And he provided a number of case examples of such change. And had some ideas about why and how they happen. But that was the last psychologist to write about this that I could find. And there wasn't even a name for it in psychology. Theologians write about it. James Loder, a contemporary theologian, has a book called The Transforming Moment, where he puzzles about what's going on with these things and how is it they happen. They're not psychologists. Maslow came close. Maslow wrote about peak experiences that don't necessarily change your life, but he got very interested in these and said they're very memorable experiences. When they happen to you, you have a really clear memory of them. It's like you can still often recover the sensory details of the moment when it happened and very clearly recall it. Often accompanied by profound emotion. They're very emotional experiences. They are not self-induced. The experience of these mystical experiences is they just kind of come out of nowhere. So it's the experience of being done unto rather than of doing something yourself. There's definitely a quality of this is something different from my ordinary experience that's happening to me right now. Very clear. And not a do-it-yourself thing, and profoundly benevolent. They're very, very positive experiences. Maslow initially wrote that these only happen to people in the second half of life, when they're kind of further along with maturation. But then he began to meet young people who had had experiences like this too. And so he changed his belief and said, actually, they seem to be able to be happening anywhere in the course of life development. So with a group of colleagues on sabbatical, we just sat around and met every couple of weeks and said, how would you study this? How did you do that? And I got ideas and came back to Albuquerque and did it. So we had a news story in the Albuquerque Journal in which we described this kind of change. It was just before Christmas, so they had a picture of a Scrooge character in there. And just one story in the newspaper. Didn't know if anybody would respond, so we got 89 calls within a couple of weeks. The phone just kept ringing and ringing and ringing. And we asked people to come and spend 3 hours with us, and we didn't offer to pay them anything. So they had to be that interested to come in and actually spend some time with us. 55 people did, completed a 2 to 3 hour structured interview with us that had both quantitative and qualitative measures built in. On average, it had been 11 years since the experience had happened. So that was kind of unexpected. It was more than a decade. And yet these people remembered it very, very vividly. Now, some had happened within the last year. Some had happened 20, 30 years ago. But the average was about 11 years ago. And most people, interestingly, had told no one about it. Or very few people. Like they told one person who thought they were crazy and decided not to tell anybody else about it after that. And when they saw the story in the paper, they said, you mean this happens to other people? I thought I was the only one. So they called up and they were fascinated to find out what we were doing and could I talk to other people that this has happened to and so on. So we got this tremendous response. All we had to do was have the one little thing in the newspaper and we got way more than enough people. It seemed to me as I sat with these recordings and transcripts that there were two kinds of quantum change. Now, whenever you have types, there are borderline cases and, it's not completely clean. But it felt like they fell into two groups. One type was the insightful type that is like being shown some kind of truth or knowledge or insight. Coming from the outside, it's not like coming to a conclusion oneself, but suddenly seeing something that you know immediately to be true. And the other, the mystical type, that more often would be called epiphanies, that really are mystical experiences. So I'll talk a bit more about those two kinds. The insightful kind of quantum change is quite sudden and discrete. Suddenly the person sees it clearly. If you know Gestalt figures, they look like one thing and then all of a sudden you can see it the other way. All of a sudden it click just goes the other way. And not like reasoning it through yourself and deciding something is true. Bam, it's noetic. It is shown to you. You're being given knowledge. It changes perception, often of oneself, of reality, of the universe. And the persons say, I immediately knew it to be true. As soon as I saw it, I knew it deeply to be true. And let me just read you a little bit of one of these stories. This is a person, less than 10% of people in our study were struggling with some kind of addiction, but this is one of them. This is somebody that had been in AA for a decade and had been sober for a decade. and in fact was sponsoring other people in AA, and felt like she had her act pretty well together. And she heard about this guy that was teaching Big Book, and so she went to see what she could learn from him. Just said, could I come by and chat with you? And he said, sure. And 5 hours later, she left. I was to leave the next day on a plane, but within that 5 hours of going over the Big Book, I experienced just a complete transformation of my understanding, not only of the AA program, but of my view of the world and my whole outlook on life. I wasn't drinking coffee that day, but I felt highly energized. I just felt like if I drank coffee, I'd blow off the face of the earth. I was already hyped energy-wise. The emotion involved in this. There was this adrenaline of my mind embracing and consuming the material that I'd been hungry for such a long time. I was crying for joy. I really wanted to know this stuff. It was just like I knew it when I heard it. I recognized it. I was really exhilarated, extremely cheerfully happy that I'd finally found what I'd been looking for. Now I was completely blown out of the water. I saw that there absolutely was nothing but doom ahead for me if I didn't do certain things that provided certainty and hope. I had gone to this person feeling like I had all these years of sobriety. I had all this experience, I'd worked with all these people. My little life was just great. I didn't think I needed anything to happen. I wasn't going because I was distraught or anything. I was just looking for some good ideas to help the people I was sponsoring. That's really all I expected. I went there to look for solutions for other people, and I found a solution for myself. I was completely devastated. But it was a joyful sort of devastation because I saw the solution within the same period of seeing the doom. In all my years of searching for solutions, I studied lots of different faiths and religions, philosophies of the world, dabbled in the occult. I realized that this was a central truth that pulled together all these truths of all the great religions and philosophers. You know, there's so many denominations around and millions of people saying our way is the only way. Now I have the sense of unity above it all and what the world is really all about. That made it even more powerful to me because I knew that this thread ran through everything else that was of value. It was not just cognitive, powerfully emotional, but it had to do primarily with seeing, with getting some knowledge, deep knowledge, and that changing entirely the way she experienced herself and the work that she was doing. So it's a good example of the insightful type. The mystical type is a mystical experience. William James described these beautifully at the turn of the last century. People who have had such an experience have a hard time putting it into words. They're hard to write about. They're hard to talk about. They're hard to explain. What happened, it doesn't readily translate into words. And people will use metaphors. Well, it was sort of like going over a waterfall, or it was kind of like similes or metaphors to try to talk about it, but the words fail them, and invariably they say, I'm just not describing it well. A noetic quality, meaning knowledge is received. A person sees something that they hadn't seen before that is powerfully true. It doesn't last long, it's transient. It's anywhere from a few minutes to a few hours. But these are not long experiences. They usually have quite a discrete beginning and then sort of fade over time. Very distinctly, the person knows this is not ordinary experience that's happening to them. And I'll read you one in a bit where that's quite clear. A very common part of the noetic quality is a sense of unity. Being one with all people, being one with all life, being one with all of creation, with all of the universe. A little tiny drop in this enormous whole that exists. And that mystical sense of union with that is a very common theme in what is seen. And that's pretty awe-inspiring. We've kind of ruined the word awesome, but these are awesome experiences. Like, wow, I'm a drop in this enormous ocean. And yet profoundly positive. So it's not depressing that you're a little tiny drop in the ocean. It's absolutely uplifting and enlightening and and the joy. There's a transcendence, a feeling of going beyond the limits of sensory reality, spirit literally, and again passivity. I'm not doing this. This is not something that I'm causing to happen. This is being given to me in some sense. So those are classic characteristics of mystical experiences. Most mystical experiences do not change people. So mystical experiences themselves are pretty common, but usually you don't have a changed life afterwards. For these people, the mystical experience, for whatever reason, triggered a major change in personality. So they have the attributes of a mystical experience that I just talked about. An immediate transforming effect. These people say, I went through a one-way door and I knew there was no going back. I knew there was no way that I could. Bill Wilson knew when he had his white light experience that he was sober. And he was not going back. And he wasn't hanging on white knuckle for dear life to not relapse. He was changed. He knew he wasn't going back. So not all mystical experiences transform the person. So you don't have to have a mystical experience for a quantum change to happen, nor is it enough to have a mystical experience for a quantum change to happen. It's neither necessary nor sufficient. The Reluctant Mystic is one of my favorite stories, and it is actually a friend of mine who was driving through the desert of eastern Oregon. I'm doing okay likewise here.
I can turn it back off after you.
People can sleep more comfortably if you... He was driving through the desert of eastern Oregon, which is kind of like driving down here from Albuquerque without the mountains, or any of the variety, or the arroyos, or any of those things, but just flat nothing, you know. And he was thinking how boring it was. And at that time we sent cassette tapes to each other. That's how long ago this was. But we could hear each other's voice that way. And so he had a tape recorder on in the car when this happened. And the tape recorder kept running, and he could describe within the minutes after it occurred what had happened to him. So what I have is a transcript of that, and this one clearly is a mystical experience. All of a sudden, out of nowhere, this wave of spiritual electricity washed over me. My body and the car and the landscape and everything started turning into smaller and smaller and smaller pieces, and everything started disappearing, including myself. I didn't know if I was having a heart attack or what was happening. During those moments, everything, including myself and the car and the landscape, just turned into little dots of light. A visual metaphor that captures something of what it looked like and felt like is the transporter beam in Star Trek, where the person being beamed up is just turned into little dots of light and goes somewhere or nowhere. It was awesome. It was terrifying. It was peaceful. Near the paradox. Terrifying and peaceful. I pulled the car off what was left of the highway, and what happened in the next few minutes changed my life. It was the annihilation of the self, which I had never heard or read about, but now was experiencing. What I felt was the actual experience, not the thought, not a discussion about, but the actual experience of being one with everything else and with God. I felt myself dissolve into it, and it dissolved into me. There was no separation. Classic Buddhist experience. But very, I read this to a psychiatrist, which I have actually. The psychiatrist is likely to say, this person needs to be in the hospital right now. This is a psychotic person. But these people that I talked to were some of the healthiest people I've ever met. So these experiences are way out of the realm of normal sensory reality and terribly important. Another of my favorite stories, this is the last one I'll read. This is a fellow scientist, hard-nosed empirical scientist in Albuquerque. And he drank a bit too much, and his family had done one of those surprise parties for him and surrounded loved ones and said, you need to go into the hospital. And the hospital had a car waiting for him outside. And so off he went. He didn't fight it. He said, okay, I'll see what the experience is like. And one of the things he discovered during the first week of his stay was during the second week, they dug into the person's history of abuse, which I don't think is a great idea, by the way, but it was a part of the program at that time. And he knew he'd been sexually abused as a child and was terrified of having to deal with that in the second week of treatment. So on the weekend, in between the first and second weeks of treatment, this happened. On Saturday afternoon, facing the beginning of Survivor's Week on Monday, I went to my room to read one of the books they gave us. I was lying on my bed thinking about this and feeling very uncomfortable because I didn't want to face it. I had seen a little of the guided imagery stuff they do, and I thought, maybe I could just sort of pretend to take a little bit of God and put it within me. Because that first week when I was looking inward, all I could find inside myself was blackness and coldness. Let's try this, I thought, and see what happens. I set the book down. I was alone in my room, and I closed my eyes and just thought, well, if God is real, how do I picture God? And the thing that came into my mind was just whiteness, a silvery whiteness everywhere, all around me, everywhere. So in my mind, I reached out. I actually did reach out my hand and tried to touch it and just take a little piece of it inside me. And when I touched it in my imagination and I turned over my hand, there was something in my hand. It was like a blue-white star, like a point of light with rays just shining out from it. I took this little point of God, this infinitesimally small part, and put it to my chest. As soon as I put it into my chest, something took over my body. It was physical. I felt like something was blowing up inside me. I could feel my skin bulging outward. I started to gasp for breath. I felt an ecstasy that was, the only way I can describe it is that it was just like a sexual climax, except that there was nothing physical to it at all. And it was better than a sexual climax, infinitely better. It was like a spiritual climax. And I was gasping for breath, and then I was grabbing the bed. This thing had control of me. I mean, something took over my body. It was very physical. I was not in control. Something was doing this to me, and I don't know how long it lasted, but probably for about 10 seconds. It seemed like a long time. When it left me, I just wept. I was just stunned. I thought, what the hell was that? I mean, it was real. That wasn't just something in my imagination. Something literally grabbed me. Something touched me. At first, I was just saying, thank you, thank you, thank you, my God, thank you. And the very next thought was, why me? Which is a very common report among these people. Not for me, but why me? Of all the people who are suffering, why did I get to have this experience? There's nothing specially deserving about me. And the next thought was, what do you want from me? I was just absolutely at a loss for why it was so intense. I was looking for some little thing to help me feel better about the next week. This was incredible, powerful, overwhelming, and I was just holding my chest. I could feel warmth like a glowing inside me. I could feel warmth and life inside me. It was like there was light inside me where there had been just darkness before. I lay there for about 10 minutes, just absolutely stunned. And then I said, I've got to record this. And I grabbed this notebook, which he pulled out of the pocket, and wrote it down when it happened. It was hard to find words for it. All we had to do was say to these people, tell me what happened. And out these stories came for a half an hour, for an hour, with the recorder running, and these are actual transcripts of what the people said. Amazing, just amazing stories. Right? The experiences themselves might not be all that amazing were it not for what happened afterwards. But one thing we asked was, what was going on before this? Was there something that led up to it? Because at least in a psychologist's mind, there ought to be something leading up to an experience like that. So was there anything in common that these 55 people reported? Well, about half of them were in a pretty desperate place, in severe physical pain, in great family trauma. You reach the end of your rope, and then the rope breaks. That kind of difficulty, trauma. I don't know what to do. One man was a gymnastics instructor, and demonstrating a trick, he fell and broke his neck. And that was the moment at which this happened to him, for which he was profoundly grateful. It's a quadriplegic man in a wheelchair talking about he wouldn't trade the experience for anything. And he kind of glows as these people do. So about half were in a really, really bad place, like Bill Wilson was. There was a lot of report of traumatic childhood. Maybe a coincidence, maybe not. There was sometimes a feeling of being stuck, trapped. I can't get out. I don't know what to do. I have no way out. That kind of desperation. Others, just a sense of aimlessness to their life. Kind of wandering and I'm not going anywhere. But then for almost half, just ordinary life, like this woman in the AA story. She didn't expect anything to happen. Scrooge going home from work, he didn't expect anything to happen. Had you stopped him and said, would you like some psychotherapy? He would have said, no thank you at best. Just ordinary life. And bam, one woman was cleaning her toilet when it happened. Another was sitting on the toilet when it happened. Another was walking across his living room past the fireplace when the fireplace spoke to him. I mean, these are, any psychiatrist would say, medication time. But these were very, very healthy people. And a third of the people were praying. This was the most common thing that people were doing just before the quantum change happened. And very often, like in the case of Bill W., it was the first prayer they had said in quite a long time. And that's sort of the story of Something Like a Star that I just read you too. But for Bill W., at the bottom of alcoholism and thinking he's dying and is trapped and doesn't know where to go, says basically, okay, God, if you're out there, this would be a good time. And bam. Well, what changed? We asked people that. And the most common answer was, everything changed. Everything changed. But we didn't settle for that. We pushed a bit. And indeed, lots and lots of things did change. There were many stories of being relieved from chronic fear, chronic depression, chronic anger that the person had held on for a long time. Just gone. Just relieved. Just removed. Released sometimes from destructive behavior patterns like addictions in a few of our cases. What about your relationships? Well, people tended to have fewer relationships, fewer friends, but deeper relationships. So they couldn't abide small talk. Couldn't abide small talk. So superficial relationships kind of drive them crazy, but they have a few very close friends that they have a deep relationship with. Spirituality became vibrant, very central to life, a deep sense of trust and safety. Some of these people went into very dangerous neighborhoods to volunteer time and felt absolutely positively safe and had been for a decade or more doing that. If you think of Maslow's idea of self-actualization, it's sort of like they got a fast forward in their life. Life was going along and all of a sudden, your development just got accelerated. Their sense of self changed, their trust in the future changed, and their priorities changed. We asked people about their values before their quantum change experience, after the quantum change experience, and now, 11 years later. After the quantum change experience and now, we're the same. But before and after were almost mirror opposites. So for the men, these were their top 12 values before their experience. Money, adventure, achievement, pleasure, being respected, family, fun, self-esteem, freedom, attractiveness, popularity, power. God stuff. Afterwards, look at the difference. Spirituality, personal peace, families actually gone up. God's will, honesty, growth, humility, faithfulness, forgiveness, self-esteem, loving, intimacy. It's like they have been catapulted into the second half of life. Women, similarly, different set of priorities, more stereotypically feminine priorities at the before, but family independence, career fitting in, looking good, knowing things, self-control, being loved, being happy, having money, so what? Changed a great deal. And family dropped down a bit. Yeah. Became less central. Still among the top values, but not primary source of identity. What's the primary source of identity? It's up here. And if you look at these two sets of after values of men and women, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 of them are the same in the top 12. So men and women went from kind of stereotypical guy and woman values to being much more like each other, much more similar to each other afterwards. We decided to do a 10-year follow-up. So now it's more than 20 years after the experience. Would they have forgotten about it? Had they fallen back to their previous ways? What was it like? So my colleague Janet Cedabaka found 41. Well, we started trying to find 41. We went through the 55 stories, and there were about 14 that didn't clearly fit into quantum change, or they just sort of wasn't clear what it was. But 41, we said that clearly is a quantum change. 6 of them she couldn't find. 3 people had died, and only 2 declined to be interviewed, and we don't know why. We didn't press them for that. So she could interview 73% of the people that she tried to find 10 years later, which is pretty good. They still remember their quantum change vividly. Still very, very present for them, still sensory clear. Nobody described having gone back to their pre-quantum change state. In fact, the normal report was, my changes continued to grow over time, continued to develop over time. And the change had persisted and grown. And some of them had had, many of them had had subsequent quantum change experiences. So they could tell us other of these moments of epiphany that had occurred to them. And very, very low distress, psychological symptoms. I mean, as I said, these were very healthy people. And just not people that you want to treat, and they're doing great. Top values were still the same, now 20 years after the change. The pre-quantum change values were still absent. You don't see money, adventure, pleasure, career, fitting in, looking good, being respected. They're just not there in the top values. When God's will was mentioned, it was always the number one value. So 1/3 of people had God's will in their top 12, and whenever that was true, it was number one. People have asked me, are these always positive, or can they go in the other direction? Can you have a quantum change to the dark side? Now, we didn't see any of those. But I talked to my friend Joe Nowinski, who's also a psychotherapy writer, and who works in prisons. And Joe said, oh yes, I've talked to a number of inmates who told me the moment at which they became evil, or the moment at which they became bad. There was like a turning point, and it just suddenly happened to them. And so Joe, in our 10-year follow-up special issue of a journal, wrote about it and gave this, talked about it in this way. People realize suddenly and with force that they have a choice what direction their life will follow, and they choose for the dark side. And it can be just like a click, a sudden click. And he had a number of these stories. Here was one. An African-American man who said, I've been thinking about becoming a lawyer, and he talked to his teacher about it. And the teacher said, that's not a realistic goal for you. You can't be a lawyer when you're an African-American. You just can't. You can't do that. It's not realistic. You got to be a realistic kid. What are you going to do with your life? Because you can't be a lawyer. You need to do something you can do. And he said, the more I thought about that afterward, what he said, the more uneasy it made me. It was then I began to change inside. I drew away from white people. He quit school, gave up his idea of becoming a lawyer, became a burglar and a numbers runner, and his nickname was Satan. Now you can say, oh yeah, people tell these stories about their past, but it sounds like that kind of moment when a decision got made. Well, being a psychologist, I had to write a chapter at the end of the book about, well, what happened? How do I explain it? And what we did actually is offer 5 possible explanations and let the reader decide. And each one of them has some truth to it. About half the cases, the person just got to a place of absolute desperation in their life, and something had to give, something had to break. I mean, they couldn't continue the way they were going. What Jim Loder's book on Transforming Moments talks about this, of just reaching the limit of what your current way of seeing the world will tolerate, and the whole thing just shatters and has to be reconstructed in some way. So about half of our people were at a place that was bad enough that you could say, yeah, they hit bottom and something had to change. But there were lots of others who weren't in a bad place, so you'd have to kind of say, well, unconsciously, there was something really going on. They weren't aware of it, but unconsciously they were in deep conflict, and that broke through. There were some things that sounded kind of like that. Jim Loder talks about a rupture in the knowing context, and you begin looking for a way of organizing reality that's going to work for you. And then something comes roaring up from the unconscious, an insight, an intuition, a vision, just appears on the edge of consciousness with really convincing force. And so it feels like it's coming from outside because it's coming from the unconscious. Great emotional release and deep relief, and then the person goes about the process of integrating it. So maybe that's what's going on. Maybe it's a process of maturation. Maybe this is something that's supposed to happen to all of us. That if you just live long enough, or in some ways, or happen to be the lucky chosen person, you come to this way of being. So maybe it's something our human race is meant to become, and these are the early recipients. Maslow talked about self-actualized people who accept themselves, others, and the world as they are. That describes these people. A kind of detachment and a need for privacy, but not self-absorbed, not self-centered people at all. They identify with all of humankind. They've had profound mystical experiences. They have deep, intimate friendships with just a few people, and they're not driven by their environment. So this is Maslow in the 60s. Pretty good description of these folks. Our own Richard Rohr here in New Mexico has a wonderful book called Falling Upward about the second half of life and the tasks that you deal with when you got the first half of your life, the achieving and making money and security and establishing identity and differentiating yourself and all that first half stuff. When you got that behind you, the tasks of the second half of life are very different. And in a way, these stories are people dealing with the second half of life. Maybe it's particular people. I mean, the first hypothesis my colleagues often say is, well, these are mentally ill people. I mean, obviously, something strange and out of the ordinary going on with them. That wasn't my sense, as I told you, exactly the opposite was the case. But sometimes certain forms of epilepsy, you can have particular kinds of hallucinations and mystical-like experiences. But I just didn't have a sense that very many of these people had their experience because there was something wrong with them. There was something profoundly right with these people. And maybe it's God. Maybe these people encountered the great mysterious realm that is beyond our sensory world, and just for a moment touched that. Well, I was in Oregon at the time. I was literally at the coast looking out the window of a cottage at this view when I was sitting with all these transcripts and trying to see what do they have in common, what do they have to teach me. And I thought I was done when I wrote that explanatory chapter. And then I had an insight. Which was, wait a minute, now these people were just as different as you can imagine to begin with. All different socioeconomic levels, lots of different personality types, men and women, rich and poor. just, there's nothing that, oh yeah, they're all the same and this is going to happen to them. And yet, what was shown to them, what they saw, what was revealed to them as truth, was strikingly similar. So I thought, what if these are messages trying to get through to us? What if these are messages to humankind, and for whatever reason, these people happen to be the recipients of them? What would those messages be? Well, one certainly is that very deep change is possible because all these people experienced it. You don't have to stay the same as you are. Human beings have the potential to change in a big way. That there are other ways of knowing besides reasoning and sensory information. Those are ways of knowing. Those are what scientists use. But there are also other ways of knowing truth as well. And the truth that you see is not to be imposed on other people. That one surprised me. I thought anybody that had such a profound experience, wouldn't they become missionaries for it? Wouldn't they begin proselytizing? Wouldn't they say, I've got to tell you what I saw and help you to see that it's true too? Not there. One guy tried it for a little while and said, no, that was the wrong thing to do. So they were so sure of the truth of what they had seen, they didn't need to persuade anybody of it. They would share it in a conversation, some of the wisdom that they had. But there was no need to go out and convert other people. Very clear, I'm not God, I'm not the center of the universe. Life is not about me. Life is much larger than us. And get over I, me, my, and mine. That's first half of life stuff. Get over it. And material reality is only a small part of everything that exists. It's a much, much bigger realm out there that you don't see with your senses if you're paying attention. And relatedly, be careful about possessions. If you get a lot of possessions, they start to possess you. You spend more time taking care of them, fixing them, maintaining them. You get a bigger house, you get more things to keep going, and it just eats up your life. So careful about possessions, they say. Many of them lived very simply. Those who experienced in a mystical type being in the presence of some great other wasn't always like a person at all, but many of them felt themselves in the presence of some awe-inspiring, other being. Many of them had no religious language for it. Those who did talked about it as God or Jesus or whatever, but many people didn't have much religious background, have no language to talk about it. But their description of the other was always the same, strikingly. A loving and accepting presence, so profound you can't even describe it. To be loved and accepted to the very depth of yourself as you are, not being asked in that moment to change, but just accepted and loved profoundly in that moment. One guy said you couldn't stand that kind of love for very long. It would kill you. Just overwhelmed by the depth of it. But no one wanted to get away from that other being. There's a profound sense of drawing. And that kind of love is actually what we are and what we're meant to be. That we're not only connected to that, that's the essence of us. That's what we're supposed to be doing and being. Shortcomings should be met with compassion and forgiveness, not judgment and punishment. There's a very forgiving people. Very accepting people of themselves and of others as well. Everybody's profoundly linked. We're all part of the same thing. It's not even like we're in the same boat. It's like we are the same boat on this journey. And all of life is a gift. These people wake up with a sense of opportunity and blessedness and giftedness to have a day, to be alive again. So then I thought I was done. Now I'm back to Portland, Oregon, where I was living at the time. And when I arrived, I learned that a dear friend had died. His name was Ken Eaton. And he was a pastor, a lifelong pastor. Had ministered compassionately to so many people. And he came to the end of his life. And a day or two before he died, his pastor from the church that I was attending went to see him. And then did his memorial service. And he told us, I went to see Ken, and I said, what am I supposed to say at your memorial service? You've done a lot of memorial services. What should I say about you? And he said, Ken didn't even stop for a second. He said, just tell him this. God is real. Life is a gift. We're here to love. This is not all there is. I said, I've heard that before. He also knew. Thanks very much. So you want to take about 10 minutes, you said, to just bounce a few things around before you can get food? One thing I learned as a trainer is never compete with food. Or coffee. Any comments or just observations, questions, whatever?
That was beautiful. I feel like I've had one of those experiences and I can just relate to everything you said.
I mean, being with these people is a privilege. They do kind of glow, you know. They're just something deeply wise. It's really interesting. And peaceful. Yeah. Yes?
Have you yourself experienced that moment of self-actualization?
I don't know, and that's what everyone that we talked to said. So just about every person said, my experience probably doesn't qualify, but I'll tell you about it. And I'm in the same spot, you know. So I tell the story in here too, but for me it had to do with a time in my life when my wife and I were trying to decide whether to have children, which is, you know, how do you decide that? I mean, you decide with your heart, basically. But something in me didn't want to do that. So she kind of was more, yeah, I want to have children. I was sort of, yeah, but I got this career going, and you know, and I was in a men's group at that time in California, and so talked about it there. I moved to Albuquerque and talked about it in my men's group there. And then on the first sabbatical, I went back to Stanford and got together with the men's group again that I'd been with there. And so we went around talking about what we were dealing with, and I said, you know, I'm really struggling with this, whether to have children or not. And I just don't feel any particular desire to do that. He said, are you still dealing with that? Goodness gracious, you know, what's going on? I said, but I just don't have any draw. There's nothing in me that, you know, wants to have children. And the man sitting next to me said, bullshit. We were at his house. He said, when you came in, what did you do? I said, well, I sat down on the floor and played with your kids. Uh-huh. And then what did you do? Well, I tucked him in and told him the story. He said, yeah. Anytime I see you in a room with adults and kids, you were the kids. What are you talking about? So I had this deep, that wasn't the moment. I had this deep tension. Came back to Albuquerque. My wife and I were sitting on the couch and talking again about have children, not have children. And suddenly, I need to tell you about my father just a bit. My memories of my father were as a depressed, withdrawn, not very present, bitter man. And in that moment, I got back 8 years of memories before my sister died, and what he was like before she died, which was like me, on the floor, playful, present, showing us the radio, doing fun things, taking us fishing. I'd forgotten all that. And I only remembered this bitter wounded man, because in a way he died when my sister did. He lived another 15 years or so, but emotionally he was dead. And I had lost those memories. And they just came flooding back to me, and for about a half an hour I could not speak. My wife had no idea what was going on, but hung in there with me. I was just weeping and getting back these memories that were still there, but I hadn't had any access to it. It's amazing what the brain can do. And it struck me in that moment that as a child, what I had said to myself is, anything that can do that to a man, I don't want any part of it. It scares me to death. Because it literally killed my father emotionally. I don't want to die emotionally. As an adult, I could then say, well, I understand what happened here. And I'm willing to take that chance. And in that moment, we decided to have children. We wound up adopting 3 children, actually, in the long run. So it wasn't like my personality changed, and I don't think in a huge way, but that very significant piece, which became a very significant piece of my life, changed in that moment. And I would not trade raising children for anything in my life. There is no experience like it. And I would not have had that, I think, had that incredible emotional download not happened to me. So that's the thing in my life that's most like this. And I didn't realize that until I'd actually written the book and just about finished it. So, wait a minute. Yeah, so maybe that's kind of like that too. So I don't know if it is or not. But
Do you feel like listening to people and their experiences might have triggered you to move towards that thinking?
look, well, I hadn't talked to any of these people by that time. This was way before my quantum change book, so I hadn't even thought about anything like this. No, it was my friend saying, "You are deceiving yourself big time," and not knowing what to do with that, and then up it came from the unconscious. All this stuff came back. Yes, please.
In your study group, was there a particular age group more predominant than others? Were there
In the people that we studied?
Uh-huh.
No, all over the map. I mean, from 20s to 80s. So, and the experience that happened all over the map. So, one person at age 7 had an experience like this, and other people, it happened to them when they were seniors, and just kind of,
More men than women?
I think we're about 50-50, actually. Yeah.
The body mechanics is a thing. Maybe we're all sort of built that way. I build things, fix things, and I think musicians have the same experience, and doctors. I needed to lift something very heavy a few days ago, and I had given it thought, and then I went to bed that night, woke up the next morning wandering around the house, and it just popped into my mind.
Mm-hmm.
And I've gone through that many times, and it really is almost spiritual when it works so well. But I'm just thinking maybe our body is really sort of built that way. We just don't cultivate it.
What a piece of work is man, huh? We're just amazing creatures. The potential that there is.
Yeah, and I mean, I kind of see it. I'm sure you're sort of familiar with Buddhist teachings.
Oh, yes.
Buddhism.
Oh, yes.
But they say that being human, because they believe in reincarnation, of course, so being human is such a gift just because you have such potential to change.
Mm-hmm.
And when you're put into a human body, that's when it happens.
Yeah.
So I would definitely agree that it's kind of in our DNA. It will happen to everyone.
The therapeutic approach I got drawn to by my own data, and I did a lot of research, is a very humanistic one of assuming that potential is there. And I don't have to provide the answers. The answers are already there. And it's creating an environment in which the answers can come forth.
And isn't that the word education?
Educare,
Exactly.
to draw forth.
To draw forth.
That's exactly it. Not install. We have installation models of education. Educare is the same thing used to take water out of a well. to draw out that which is already there. I think it's probably refreshment time. So,